Hi there, my name is Sushma Malik and I am a Roman historian and lecturer in classics at the University of Roehampton. From the syllabus section, The Foundations of Rome, I'm going to focus first a little bit on the legendary kings, the origins of Rome from 753 to 616 BC. I won't go into the entirety of 753 to 616 BC, but instead focus a bit on the origins, the far origins of Rome up to kind of Romulus and Remus, and look at the fact that this is a very difficult period because while we have some literary evidence like Plutarch's Life of Romulus and the account of Livy and Virgil's Aeneid to some extent, we also need to complement the literary sources with the archaeological record. So here I'm going to focus in quite a lot on what we know from archaeology and then what we know from literature and see how those two things marry up, and hopefully at the end also talk about how this can work in a classroom. One of the ways I found it helpful to approach this very problematic period of Roman history in terms of evidence is to look at the theme of history and myth. So with this, you can introduce the students to the problem that the literary sources tend to be mythological, but also then tell them that we have an archaeological record that can help to bring a little bit of clarity to it as well. So in a section like this, I would look at who were the kings of Rome, what their main achievements were according to the Roman tradition, so according to that myth and history that we have, and also what the archaeological evidence is to support this. And in particular today, I'll focus on the Roman Forum, but of course, other sites can be looked at as well, such as the Palatine Hill. So first we begin with the context of how Rome comes into being. So this map shows Italy, and we're going to begin very briefly with the Bronze Age, which is roughly around 1800 to 1200 BCE. This period is generally thought of by historians and archaeologists as having a unified culture named after the Apennine Mountains, hence the Apennine culture. This was a pastoral and agricultural society, mainly living on hilltops. It's pre-industrial and relied heavily on farming. We begin to see a change in terms of the archaeological record in about 1200 BCE, and this is where the Bronze Age starts to turn into the Iron Age. What this means is that there are more settlements and bigger settlements, so we see a population increase. We also get technological improvements in terms of metalworks and crucially, a change in burial practices. I say crucially because burial practices are really useful for showing us kind of what's happening culturally when we have so little evidence otherwise. So what we see is a change from inhumation, or the burial of a body in the ground, to cremation, so the burning into ashes of a body and then burial in an urn. And we see this in some areas, not throughout Italy, but in some areas. And what this suggests is greater cultural diversity, so to some extent people going their separate ways when it comes to this idea of burial practice. One of the places in which cremation culture is seen is Latium in central Italy, and this is the part of Italy that includes the city of Rome. Latium, of course, is also where Aeneas ends up, and we'll come back to Aeneas in a bit once we've looked at the archaeological evidence. To give you more of a sense of the diversity of the area, we know that approximately 40 different languages were spoken throughout Italy at this time, and the inhabitants of Latium spoke an old or archaic form of Latin. That's where the name Latin comes from, Latium. Other languages include things like Etruscan and Oscan, but of course as we go into later periods of Roman history, Latin becomes the predominant language spoken. From Latium then, we can focus in a little bit more, zoom in if you like, in archaeological terms on what is happening in Rome during this period. So we all know that famously Rome is built on 7 hills. In fact, as you can see from this map, there were more than 7. The canonical 7, as it were the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Palatine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, and the Quirinal. But you can also see there, for example, the Oppian Hill that isn't included in the canonical 7. But the point is that Rome had a hilly landscape which allowed for communities to establish on the hilltops, but also in the valleys as well. So, for example, the later sites of the Forum Boarium, the cattle market, and the Forum Romanum, which would eventually become the commercial and political centre of Rome, are both in valleys in between hills. So the Forum Romanum, for example, will eventually be in the area between the Capitoline and the Palatine. This is how the forum looks today, and you obviously can see that it's layers upon layers of monuments that tell us, all about Rome's history to some extent, not just its ancient history, but medieval as well, and later even. But back in the Iron Age, we find burials in this area dating from about the 12th to the 8th centuries BCE. Specifically, the site of the Sepulchratum marked on the map, which is a necropolis. The site is now the temple of Antoninus Pius, which you can see if you visit Rome, but it was in the Iron Age a burial site. So as the population increased during the later Iron Age, so about the 9th to the 8th centuries BCE, the burials start to get pushed out of the forum because it's used instead for domestic and civic spaces, which are now starting to form, we think, more widely over this area. And when I say domestic spaces, what I mean is huts, primarily, and fortified walls, so evidence of people living but also trying to protect their different areas. And again, perhaps here in terms of teaching, this evidence, it's useful to think about how domestic and civic spaces can be formed in over landscape, perhaps with some other examples as well from the UK perhaps or elsewhere. So what we've seen then is the city of Rome and Latium as a wider area change from the Bronze Age of Italy with a very unified culture to the Iron Age, where we start to see more cultural diversity. And in the space that would become the Forum itself between the Capitoline and the Aventine, the Capitoline and the Palatine hills, becoming somewhere that was used for burials into a place with more population, and those burials being pushed out of that site further away from the centre of Rome. So that's the archaeological story up to the foundation of Rome in the 8th century BC, roughly. But of course, there's also a mythical story that's of what happened in this period, and it was that that Rome came to be founded. This is the story that goes from Aeneas to Romulus and Remus. Romulus was supposed to have founded Rome in about 753 BCE, and this is the same sort of time as our archaeological evidence tells us that habitation was spreading further through Rome around about the 8th century. So there is some congruence here then between the myths and the archaeology. We can use one to substantiate the other. Romulus and Remus were the twins who came from the royal family in Alba Longa. There's a question mark on this map where Alba Longa may be, because Alba Longa is a mythical place. There is nowhere in antiquity that was actually called that. But of course, we do have the Alban Hills just south of Rome, so this is probably around the right sort of area that our mythology is thinking of. Alba Longa itself was founded by the son of Aeneas, Ascanius. So Aeneas, as Virgil tells us, was a semi-divine Trojan prince, so his mother was Venus, who fled Troy as it was being captured and destroyed by the Greeks. He took his father Anchises with him on his shoulder, but he also leads his son by the hand. His son is Ascanius. Ascanius is just one name for this boy. The alternative name is Iulus, and much later on, Julius Caesar would use that name, Iulus, to claim descent of the Julian family that he was a part of for his family. Aeneas eventually ends up, after he has fled Troy, in Latium, where he and his followers settle, although, of course, after much travelling, as you will know if you've read the Aeneid. So these pieces of evidence on the PowerPoint then show that moment, if you like. It has Ascanius by the hand and Anchises on his shoulder. And these are from much later periods, but it demonstrates how that myth became so pervasive in Roman culture and in Roman political history as well. So in Latium then, Aeneas founds the city of Lavinium on the coast, and Ascanius then goes on to found Alba Longa, and Romulus and Remus are descended from the family of Ascanius. So this is the family tree of the kings of Alba Longa as we get towards Romulus and Remus. Numitor is the king of Alba Longa, but Aemilius is his jealous brother, and Aemilius overthrows Numitor and banishes him. Aemilius is worried, though, that Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, could produce a male heir and therefore propagate Numitor's line, so he forces her to live her life as a virgin. However, Mars, the god of war, visits Rhea Silvia and impregnates her. She gives birth to Romulus and Remus. To protect Romulus and Remus from Aemilius, she puts them in a basket and sends them off down the river. They are rescued by a she-wolf in the place that will become Rome, by the area that will be known as the Palatine. So here we have a lovely artistic representation of Romulus and Remus being suckled or suckling at the teat of the she-wolf. So this is an Etruscan mirror, so beautiful, beautiful object, but with this ornate decoration. When Romulus and Remus grow up, they decide they want to found a city. These are described, Romulus and Remus are described as men who know, in their blood that they are royal, and also, of course, being descendants of Mars, the foundation of the city is perhaps something that comes naturally to them. But then, of course, the question is which one of them should do it, and they decide to have a competition to determine who should be allowed. Birds are auspicious in ancient religion, particularly Etruscan religion, from which Roman religion took a lot of its rituals. So they decided to count birds. Remus set himself up on the Aventine Hill, and he sees 6 birds. Romulus sets himself up on the Palatine Hill and sees 12 birds. Now, you might think that Romulus is therefore the clear winner, but Remus saw his 6 birds first, so Remus and his followers claimed that Remus had won. Romulus, however, claimed that he had won and took the initiative first. He went down from the Palatine Hill and marked out a sacred boundary around that hill. So this map shows that boundary that's marked out around the Palatine, known as the Pomerium. So this meant that Rome, the city, was now encased in not a physical wall, but in a sacred barrier, which should not be crossed without Romulus's permission. Remus, however, did cross the boundary, and that gave Romulus all he needed to kill Remus. This, according to the literature, is how we end up then with populations settling in Rome in the 8th century BC. And here again we can see, the story relating to the archaeology. So the archaeology tells us around this time, as populations were growing, as technology was getting better, this land became more habitable, and people started to live in the domestic and use it for domestic as a domestic space. And the mythology gives us a similar outcome, but with a very different story. So here, for this sort of topic, again, I think it's about showing the students that although these stories are, fantastic, full of gods and monsters to some extent, they can still bear resemblance to what we find in the archaeology as well.